promise you we will govern on behalf of all Americans.
Vice President Kamala Harris has selected Tim Walz as her running mate.
This thing that it's so close, let's just win big, people. Let's just win.
There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm, and a lot of energy with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz at the top of the ticket.
Hello, welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Leigh Caldwell, anchor at Washington Post Live and also co-author of the Early Brief newsletter. Coming to you today from Chicago, where the Democratic National Convention is, of course. And I am joined by Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. Senator Murphy, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So we have you on a great day. You're coming off speaking at the DNC and the main stage last night. First, softball question, how was it? Talk about that experience, because that crowd was electrified.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a very different feel inside that convention from anything else that I've been a part of. There's a sense of raw joy that you can feel, hopefully coming through on the TV screen, that you absolutely feel on the floor. And I was really proud to be a part of it last night. I spent the better part of the last year trying to negotiate this bipartisan border agreement. And this is a topic that is normally and often pretty controversial inside the Democratic Party. But last night we were united in our belief that Kamala Harris can make the case that she is the best candidate to secure our border, because Donald Trump had the ability to get behind a bipartisan border bill that would have, not fixed all of the problems on the southern border, but been the biggest down payment on fixing the problems at the border in decades. And he threw it away because he wants chaos at the border. He can't imagine a world in which he can't complain about the border and use it as a mechanism to divide this country from each other. Kamala Harris has been really clear in this campaign.
Yeah, you've, like you said, focused
It
your
was
speech.
It was good, and it was good for the party to get behind that message last night.
Yeah, so President Trump, though, is still calling, and Republicans calling Kamala Harris the border czar, not accurately portraying her role in the administration there, which is not about the border, but about, the triangle, the pass-through countries, and trying to stabilize relations there. So, how should Democrats and how should Senator Harris or Vice President Kamala Harris respond to those attacks? Because those are going to be constant from now until Election Day.
So listen, I think we should be on the offense, because I think we've got a really good story to tell. It's not just the contrast on the bipartisan border bill. Trump's against it, Kamala Harris is for it. It is also about telling the story of what she did, the job she was given. As you mentioned, she was given the job of trying to reduce migration from 3 specific Central American countries, a very difficult job. Within 2 years of being given that job, migration from those countries was down by 50 to 60%. There's also an apples to apples comparison about the numbers at the border. Yes, the numbers were high midway through the Biden administration. There's a pretty simple explanation for that. There was a backup of people who couldn't come during the pandemic, who surged to the border when the pandemic restrictions were lifted. But today, there are fewer people crossing on a daily basis than at the end of the Trump administration. So I just think this is a pretty easy and true message. Trump's against the border bill. Kamala Harris is for it. Kamala Harris was given a job to reduce migration from 3 key countries in Central America, and she did it. Border crossings are lower today under Kamala Harris and Joe Biden than they were at the same time in the Trump presidency. I think I'm convinced that that's a winning message, and the Democrats should be on the offense.
My colleagues are reporting this morning that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said yesterday at a Brennan Center event here in Chicago that he would change the rules, which means the filibuster, the 60 vote threshold in the Senate, to pass the issue of voting rights. Is that something that you support, a narrow change of Senate rules to get rid of the 60 vote threshold on the issue of voting rights?
Well, I personally would probably favor a broader change. I mean, I'm on the record as saying that the filibuster, I think, is pretty fundamentally anti-democratic. I'm open to lots of different reform proposals. One of the things I've always liked is the the talking filibuster, preserve the right to filibuster, but you actually have to stand up and keep talking, or a group of senators have to stand up and keep talking and hold the floor. So I think it's pretty clear that we will probably need to change the rules of the Senate in order to do some very important things. At the top of that list would be codifying Roe versus Wade. And the question is, if there's 50 or 51 Democratic senators, what are the other things that you could get consensus on amongst those 50 or 51 to also change the rules for? Voting rights certainly might be in that basket of items. I probably would agree to a much longer list. Others of my colleagues would probably agree to a shorter list. I would certainly hope that everybody would be on board to change the rules to codify the right to a safe and legal abortion. Beyond that, it'll be a discussion that Chuck Schumer, hopefully as majority leader, will have to lead when we come back at the beginning of next year, hopefully with Kamala Harris in the White House.
So you mentioned codifying Roe. What also about an issue that you've worked on a lot regarding gun safety, to perhaps maybe an assault weapons ban or expanded background checks?
Yeah, I guess what offends me the most about the filibuster is when it stands in the way of a policy that has broad public support. And expanded background checks, which is supported by 90% of Americans, just saying every commercial sale of a gun in this country is going to come with a 5-minute instant criminal background check. That is a wildly popular policy. I do not think that 40 senators should be able to stop a policy that's supported by 60 and is supported by 90% of the American public. Now, an assault weapons ban is very popular too. Most polls today show that that's supported by over 60% of Americans. But maybe my suggestion is to start with universal background checks. I think that that's something that we could easily justify changing the rules to get done. But again, I don't get to make that decision on my own. I would certainly change the rules of the Senate in order to pass universal background checks. Other senators will have a say in that as well.
I want to ask you about affordability. That is obviously an issue that that Americans care about and are worried about, with inflation, which is stabilized, but also housing, other costs. So, was it a mistake politically in the first 2 years of President Biden's term to focus on kind of the climate change components of infrastructure and IRA? Should the administration and the Democratic Congress focus more on economic cost proposals to bring down costs?
Well, if you remember, the original Build Back Better proposal had a very significant investment in housing. The problem in our housing market today is largely a lack of supply, right? When you just aren't building enough houses to keep up with demand, price is going to spike, both for ownership opportunities and rental opportunities. The president back in early 2021 proposed building 1 million new affordable housing units in this country. No Republicans would support it. And when we went to the 50 Democrats to try to figure out what we could all agree on, unfortunately, that housing proposal was not on the list. We were able to get across the finish line the revision of the tax cuts for the wealthy, the investments in renewable energy, and the changes in how we buy prescription drugs. So I don't think it's for lack of trying. This was a priority for President Biden and Vice President Harris. We just didn't get any cooperation from Republicans, and with that really narrow Democratic majority, couldn't get that proposal across the finish line. I remember in the Senate that Kamala Harris was probably the loudest and most consistent voice on the need to build more affordable housing. This is not a new issue for her. When she was in the Senate, she'll make the decision what her priority will be if she's elected, but I wouldn't be surprised that housing would be at the top of the list.
She's getting a lot of criticism for some of her economic proposals that she laid out were about price gouging, tackling price gouging. Um, was it a mistake in her young campaign to frame it that way?
Oh, absolutely. I think that you have to meet the American public where they are when it comes to how they intersect with this economy. Americans think they're getting screwed. Americans think that big companies have far too much power over their lives. They want there to be a fundamental shift of power away from these big, giant, shadowy companies to individual consumers. And I hope that you'll see a series of proposals from the Harris campaign about how to do that. So I don't know, I mean, maybe there's economists out there that don't like the term price gouging, but Americans absolutely think that they are getting gouged. They think that they are padding the profits of the billionaire ownership class of these companies in a way that is completely unnecessary. So I really applaud her for coming out with that proposal, and I think and hope that you'll see more like it.
I want to switch gears a little bit to foreign policy, but actually with a domestic twist. You are at the convention, see lots of delegates. I'm sure you've noticed the uncommitted delegates or the people who are wearing the scarves that say Democrats for Palestinian rights. The issue of Israel and Gaza has been a tension point in the party since the war began in October of last year, and there's been some simmering tensions here in Chicago at the convention. There's the protests, of course, outside the convention halls, but there's these uncommitted delegates who are members of the Democratic Party who have asked for a speaking slot for a Palestinian American to have a speaking slot at the convention. The Harris campaign last night confirmed that that will not happen. Was that a mistake? Should a Palestinian American have a speaking slot at this convention?
Listen. I think what the story of this convention is the unity in our party. Obviously, there's been an ongoing disagreement in this country over the way in which Israel is conducting the war inside Gaza. There's a disagreement inside the Democratic Party about that. That has been visible for months, that is visible at this convention. No, I don't think you need somebody on the podium in order to make clear that there are a bunch of people in this country who disagree with the administration's decision to support Israel's right to defend itself. Kamala Harris has, I think, made it pretty clear that she wants this war to be brought to a close, that she wants a ceasefire. I think she was purposefully vocal, even as vice president, about the concern she registered for the civilian loss of life inside Gaza. But I don't necessarily know that that it's necessary to put somebody up on that podium. Everybody knows that there has and will continue to be a disagreement, a healthy disagreement inside the Democratic Party about how the administration approaches the crisis in Gaza.
hmm we have a question from the audience on this issue that I want to bring up. Colleen from your home state of Connecticut. She asks, why doesn't the U.S. or she wants to know why the U.S. doesn't provide Iron Dome weapons only to Israel and stop selling any kind of offensive weapons to Israel. So she is asking a question similar to what the uncommitted delegates want to, which is why do weapons transfers of billions of dollars to Israel as this war is going on?
Well, listen. Let me just speak for myself. I called for Israel to immediately halt military operations probably several months ago. I have said that the United States should not continue to sell weapons to Israel if Israel is not serious about stemming the humanitarian catastrophe inside Gaza. So I believe that we should be using more leverage with Israel in order to try to bring this war to a close. The president has said from the beginning that he believes Israel has a right to defend itself, that he wants Hamas destroyed. As you also know, and Colleen knows, the president did for a period of time stop transferring some weapons to Israel as a means to try to get them to rethink their strategy in Rafah, which they did. Ultimately thousands of lives were saved in Rafah, in part because this administration decided for a period of time to withhold arms sales in order to get Israel to rethink its offensive operations there. So I do think the administration has at times, with some criticism, used the leverage that comes with our defensive relationship to get Israel to be more mindful of civilian casualties. And then there are people like me who would probably advise the administration to be even more aggressive. And listen, I think it's a sign of a healthy party that we get to have this just agree with everything this administration has done on foreign policy. We are not a cult of personality like the Republican Party is. And, hopefully that's part of the advertisement for supporting Democrats, that we, don't close ranks as a matter of course, that we sometimes have open disagreements. That's a good thing.
As a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is in the Mideast right now trying to negotiate a ceasefire. Do you think that he'll get one on this trip?
Well, if anybody can get one, it's Secretary of State Blinken. He's got a great team behind him. I am still hopeful. Obviously, we heard this heart-wrenching testimony last night at the convention from the family of a young believed to still be alive. The only path forward here is to get that ceasefire and to get those hostages home. But of course, my worry is that Benjamin Netanyahu is operating with one priority, and that is his personal political salvation. That his top priority is not Israel's security, is not necessarily those hostages. It is staying in power. He may not see a deal, a ceasefire, as serving his personal political interests, and that Hamas may be coming to the same conclusion as well, that they are not well served by agreeing to this ceasefire. So Blinken is an extraordinary diplomat. If anybody can get it done, it's him. But I think it is worrying that this deal has been on the table for as long as it has, and it has been difficult to get both Hamas and the Israelis, our ally Israel, to say yes.
Do you think that this is the last chance for a ceasefire right now?
No, I don't think this is the last chance, but there is certainly a risk of escalation if this ceasefire does fully fall apart. A risk of escalation with Iran, a risk of escalation on the northern borders. The stakes are high. We are all rooting for this to get done. I do not think it's a matter of more effective American diplomacy. I think we have done everything possible to try to achieve this ceasefire. I think it's now a question for Netanyahu and for Hamas as to whether they want to put the security of Israel, the welfare of the people of Gaza first, or they want to put their political interests first.
If Kamala Harris were to win the presidency, do you think that she should re-enter the Iran nuclear deal?
I certainly believed at the beginning of the Biden administration that we should have re-entered the agreement. And I think if we had, Iran would have come back into compliance. And I think the region would have been safer. I think it's a very different story right now. I mean, the provocations of Iran, their support for Hamas, their support for the Houthis, who are actively shooting at U.S. interests in the region, I think demands a fresh look as to whether it makes sense to start any kind of diplomatic conversation with Iran. I'm never opposed to talking to your enemies, but I do not think that this is, I believed it was in 2021. I do not know that it is the right time to unilaterally re-enter the nuclear agreement. It probably makes sense at some point to sit down and start talking to Iran about a very discrete agenda. I don't know whether that would include the original JCPOA. That, by the way, is, major portions of it are set to expire soon. So, going back into that deal without revisions right now would be of limited efficacy because some of those provisions aren't going to be enforced for very
long. Do you think that the sanctions that the U.S. and others have placed on Iran, has that escalated the tensions in the region, or has it helped to keep them at bay? And then it would be much worse if they weren't in place.
Um, Listen, I think that we have had no choice given Iran's behavior, given Iran's continued support for these terrorist groups, to use our sanctions policy to, at the very least, send a signal to the world that there is a price to pay if you do business with groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Ultimately, these sanctions are there for a reason. We are, trying to send a moral signal, but we are also trying to gain leverage. And just like the Obama administration did on the nuclear program, if at some point an Iranian regime is ready to change its trajectory on its nuclear program, ready to lessen or eliminate its support for terrorist groups, then we should be willing to sit and talk with them, even as an adversary, about better behavior from Iran with verifiability in exchange for sanctions relief. I don't feel like that's a conversation that's ripe today, but at some point over the next 4 years, it may be. And again, that's the point of sanctions, is to try to compel different behavior. If Iran is willing to enter into a conversation about different behavior in the region, then there may be a time and place to have that discussion.
Would you accept position in the Harris administration, perhaps Secretary of State?
I'm on the ballot this November, and so my focus right now is making sure that I convince the people of Connecticut to give me a third term, excuse me, and get Kamala Harris elected. So I'm not focused on anything other than those two very important elections.
Not a no, Senator. um, so what do you, actually, let me go here first. You have talked a lot about the loneliness epidemic in America. I want to ask you about that. How did you become, how did this issue arise for you? And how critical is it? And should Democrats talk about it more?
Yeah, I think we should. I think that actually Americans are really open to a conversation, that that really goes deep into the way that people are feeling today. I do think we have a loneliness and a disconnection epidemic in this nation right now. I think a lot of those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were deeply lonely people who were, looking for an identity, were looking for a purpose, and they found it in a very, very dangerous place. So if you care about the threats to democracy, I think you have to care about people who have become, disrupted from their connection to each other. The statistics are really, really scary. Today, we spend half as much time with friends and family as we did just 30 years ago. 30 years ago, there was only 2% of Americans who had no friends. Today, that number is 15%. The number of Americans with less than 3 friends has doubled in that same amount of time. And so when you look at these rising rates of overdose, of self-harm, of violence, of political instability, I think a lot of it is due to the fact that people are having a harder time finding each other. And, the government should not be in charge of helping people find friends, right? But there are things that have happened, like the erosion of our downtowns, for instance, like the refusal of government to stop technology companies from creating addictive machines, that has facilitated people's withdrawal from each other. I probably care most about this issue as a parent, right, who have watched our kids be, attacked by technology that is designed to force them into lives of withdrawal. I think parents want a government that is actively thinking about how to get kids connected to each other again. But I also see that the same phenomenon is playing out with adults. And every time that I go back to Connecticut and talk about loneliness, I have just crazy numbers of people, both on the right and the left, who raise their hands, who want to be part of that conversation. I think we should all be talking about this, Republicans and Democrats. And though it doesn't sound like a topic that is a normal one for political discourse, I think that you'll find a lot of ordinary Americans who want to have that conversation and want to understand the ways that government can help them reconnect with each other.
I actually want to play a clip from President Obama and his Tuesday night speech, who kind of addressed this. Let's listen and
Yeah.
we'll talk on the other side.
We live in a time of such confusion and rancor, with a culture that puts a premium on things that don't last. Money, fame, status, likes. We chase the approval of strangers on our phones. We build all manner of walls and fences around ourselves, and then we wonder why we feel so alone. We don't trust each other as much because we don't take the time to know each other. And in that space between us, politicians and algorithms teach us to caricature each other and troll each other and fear each other.
So you have been talking about this. President Obama said this on a national stage. Is this a conversation that elected officials are actually having?
Well, I think we're beginning to have that conversation. I spent part of my summer in my office talking to a set of Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate about this issue of loneliness, trying to sketch out a small set of early proposals that both parties could get behind to start talking about the things that government could do better to help people find each other. I started a national conversation with the Republican governor of Utah around this same topic, right? Trying to rediscover our concern for the common good. So I think there are more and more politicians who want to get into this conversation. And again, I think we understand that there are things that government can do and things that government can't do. I mean, for instance, one of the things that's happened over the last 30 years is that a lot less people are going to church. A lot of people used to find connection, used to find meaning and purpose in religious affiliation. I don't know if the government is going to, has the keys to get people back to church. But something else that's going on is that people just have much less free time. You got to work 70 hours a week to have the same standard of living that 40 hours a week would have delivered you 40 years ago. And so you got a lot of people who just don't have leisure time anymore, who don't have the ability to sign up and join a club or a group in their community, who don't have time to go for a walk with their neighbor because they got 2 or 3 jobs. Now that's public policy. That's a decision to just make sure that 40 hours a week is enough to live on so that you can have your evenings and weekends free to go find friendships and connections. So I think there are a lot of Republicans and Democrats who are ready to talk about this. And I was super glad that President Obama framed this conversation, which I think is increasingly ready for prime time.
Mm-hmm. We are about out of time, but I have one quick question for you, Senator, and that's, of course, tonight is the big night. Vice President Kamala Harris is going to give her keynote speech, her acceptance speech. What does she need to say? What do you want to hear from her?
Oh, I'm not going to give her any advice. I mean, in part because she's hit, every single important note. I mean, I think one of the things that'll be nice for her to do tonight is, to tell her story in her own words. She was thrown into this campaign quickly, right? Thrown into the heat of the battle so quickly that maybe she hasn't had the opportunity to just slowly tell this country why she got involved in politics, what motivated her to be a public servant, how her parents impacted that journey. I think that personal narrative, which you have the ability to do when you're up on stage for a half an hour or 40 minutes, I think it'll be really, really interesting to people. So I'm not in the business of giving her advice these days because it seems like everything that she's done since she's gotten the race has been right. But that's a story that is a really inspiring story. It's a uniquely American story, and I hope that she takes some time to tell it tonight.
Great. Senator, thank you so much for your time today. I know these conventions are so busy. So again, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Leanne.
And thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear others, please consider subscribing to the Washington Post. You can go to washingtonpost.com/live for a free trial. Thanks so much. I'm Leigh Caldwell.